Well, welcome to the sixth gathering of the Luncheon Society. It's now our 26th season. We've had a lot of wonderful people thus far. We have some amazing things planned for the rest of the year. My advice to you is just kind of keep in touch, watch your email, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. For those who are unfamiliar with the Luncheon Society, we started in 1996 or thereabouts. We have grown to 4 cities. We were in New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and San Francisco, but then came the pandemic, so we moved to Zoom. And you know, Zoom has really worked out for us in a big way because there are a lot of folks like Anne-Marie who are far, far away, who couldn't join us, but now can join us on a regular basis. What we will have though coming up, and this is really important to keeping in touch, we're going to have a series of gatherings in Los Angeles, New York, Boston, and New York. We'll just have a party, for lack of a better term. And so now that I'll be flying a heck of a lot more, I'll be able to work that out. So, you know, this is a fun book to read. I really, I'm excited about reading. When you look back at the storied career of these women, it is a classic case of smart women meeting the dawn of the women's movement. Because you have the classic story of you have these 4 women, they couldn't get jobs in traditional media because they were, or if they could, they were relegated to the girls' stories, or maybe the networks already had their sole woman in the form of Cassie Mackin or Nancy Dickerson or whomever. And so thankfully for all of us, there was this place called National Public Radio, which all things considered is now celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And through their brilliance, through their dint, through their hard work, through their effort, they have essentially become the voice of National Public Radio. It's this, I like to joke that I wish I had that voice. It's that soothing, empathetic voice that makes you feel smarter just by listening to it. And we're all thankful for their efforts. We're excited that Catherine's on the phone, that Hale has joined us. And with that, we're going to introduce Lisa. Lisa, give us about 5 or 10 minutes about the book. Then we'll go right into a Q&A. And I think we've got a sound connection. And there we go.
I hope you can hear me now. Yes. Is that better? Good.
Much better.
Okay. Good. So there's already a question, which is great, but I'll just very briefly summarize that I came at this book not from the feminism angle, but more so initially from the media history angle, because after decades as a journalist, I find myself really enthralled with how we got to where we are today. And my last book was about Ted Turner and the making of CNN. Which was surprising to me, this backstory, even though that's where I started my career as a very young person, as an intern before CNN was, all caps CNN. And that made me start thinking about how NPR, which I had sort of danced around the fringes of as a reporter for Marketplace, which is the public radio show, but not an NPR show, it made me curious knowing that 50th anniversary was coming up, how it began. And that, of course, required me to go back deeper into some history of radio and, of course, of public broadcasting, and to find that, today we know that NPR is a major media powerhouse. It's a big buck concern. It raises, hundreds of millions of dollars for stations all around the country every year, but I didn't really understand how it worked, even as a former business reporter, and how it was a marginalized medium back when NPR was chartered in 1970. So the device to tell the story seemed to be these 4 incredible women who, again, everybody knows their names, but it seemed like their backstories were not something that were talked about, just as they often are with any sort of celebrity. So finding out that it's hard to imagine that Nina Totenberg had a hard time getting a job when she was a young woman, but that was the case because no reflection on her, but on women in general. And I had read and had actually worked for Lynn Povich, who wrote that terrific book, The Good Girls Revolt, which some of you may be familiar with, and that Newsweek lawsuit, even though I'd worked for Lynn and she'd brought me into MSNBC years ago. I had no idea that this was an issue in journalism. Of course, I knew that women had struggled for so long. My mother had brought me up well to explain that money was something that, you know, women weren't allowed to touch for a long time, and mortgages weren't in women's names nor bank accounts. But it stitched together for me, and hopefully for a reader, a really interesting story about 4 mini biographies that, like I say, I hope are surprising, stitched together within, in the late 70s, the arrival of Frank Mankiewicz, son of Herman, one of Sydney's subjects, who both brought acclaim in a different way than the 4 women did to NPR, but almost killed it. And so that's sort of the dramatic focus. It's not a comprehensive, what we call cradle to grave biography of the women or of NPR, just like my CNN book was really about the launch, how CNN almost about 5 times didn't get off the ground. So there's slices of life. So that's what brings me here to you today. And the book just came out last week, so it's interesting to see how people react to it. Some younger people I still don't think really understand, despite my best efforts, that it really was different for women back then. And I know that within NPR, there's all kinds of conversations about diversity and inclusion and their challenges, but I hope I've illuminated that it was a different era then, and how it really was not a foregone conclusion that NPR was going to take off and succeed and become what it is today. I will go, this looks like a terrific question here from Karen. When NPR started in, do you want to read it? Or
you know, actually what I'll do is I'll just cue the name and they'll ask the question. So then we can kind of really so Steve Schlesinger, you got the first slice of the pie. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry.
Steve, you're on mute.
Okay, you can hear me now, right? I wanted to ask particularly about Cokie Boggs, because when I was at Harvard, I got to know her when she was at Wellesley. In fact, she fixed me up with one of her friends at one point. And in my dormitory was a man named Steve Roberts. And Steve, of course, married Cokie. And so that, you know, there was that kind of personal connection. And we kept in touch, all of us, through the years. One of the things that struck me, though, was that the question I have is, because I was always excited about Cokie's career. This is a woman who is, as you know, because you wrote the book, I haven't read it yet, had started in this small group called the National Public Radio that very few people knew about. Yet when she died, she had an obituary on the front page of the New York Times. What was it in Cokie in particular? I'm not talking about the others or negating their worth, but I'm just wondering, what was it about her that captured the imagination of the country that she should end up with a obit on the front page of the New York Times? I'm just very curious about that.
Well, I mean, it's a little intimidating given that there are family members of Cokie's here.
We can open it up to them too.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly. Bob, do you want me to answer that question?
Well, why don't we do this? Well, why don't we do this? Well, and the nice thing about what we have here is that answer the question, and what we'll do is, like on any good baseball game, we'll go get some color commentary from Catherine and Hale and Jill, and we'll kind of flesh that question out in that direction. So take it away.
Okay, well, my first answer to the question is that the other 3 women are still very vibrant and alive, and don't know what's going to happen. Unfortunately, you know, one day when we're all gone, what will happen? But Cokie made a leap to television, as you know, and then made a leap again and became a major best-selling author. So she was a singular force in journalism, and also a pioneering force in journalism as her colleagues are, because women just didn't do what she did. And certainly when she got onto television. She was brought onto television because there were very few women talking about the kinds of subjects which were her bailiwick, so to speak. So she just rose to a certain level of fame because she went to television that she might arguably have not if she stayed on public radio. Of course, who knows what would have happened. She also had an amazing deal in that before journalists were multimedia and expected to perform on every single godforsaken platform that we don't even know exists yet, she was a multimedia star and was able to negotiate staying at NPR when she got chosen to be on the Brinkley show. And that was unusual at that time. That wasn't something that was a foregone conclusion that you would have two jobs. Journalistic organizations wanted to keep you for themselves, but that's a testament to her as well as to her love of radio. She saw that radio was a powerful force, even though TV obviously made her more money and more stardom in our society. There's just more people watching television. So that would be my answer to that. But then I guess the other answer is clear that she was beloved. And it was, I think, to most people a surprise that she did pass when she did die. It wasn't a long, protracted illness that people had followed, as sometimes is the case with famous people. So that would be my guess.
Let's open this up. Hale, if memory serves, she was your godmother. Is that correct?
Good memory, Bob. And Lisa, this is Hale. Thank you, for doing the book. And I am looking forward to reading it. And she was my godmother, my dad's younger sister. And I guess all that I'd say, I agree with everything you said. And becoming someone who was on screen made a huge difference, obviously. And she was very good on screen, as she was on the radio. But the other thing I'd say about her, to the question, she was always the same person. In other words, there was no sort of separate persona
True.
of the media personality versus my aunt and godmother. And I think that came across to people who interacted with her, whether it was hearing her on NPR or seeing her on television or in whatever capacity. And, it's hard to know how that translates over time to bigger things and, more people caring about who you are. But I think that quality, if there was one that I could identify about her that was, pretty special, it was that one.
Right. Yeah. Universally, you hear that about her. And it's so nice to hear you on a deeply personal way. She's one of those people who everybody who met her seemed to think that she was their best friend. And they were her best friend. So just the warmth, I think, obviously translated on television. And that's why they put her on. They auditioned other women, but she's the one they chose.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Because this is great that we have family members here. And Catherine and Barbara, I believe you're both on mute.
So I would say, to Lisa's last point, they didn't put her on television because of her. They put her on television because of her incredible knowledge.
Yeah.
Right.
And when she went on, I think she and Linda both went on the PBS NewsHour. It was because of their incredible knowledge of Congress. And of course, as Cokie's TV career blossomed, she brought to bear a kind of expertise based, Hale, as you know, from family, from years, from it was her knowledge of Congress was, no one could match it. And that's why she was hired. Let's be clear. She was an asset in every possible way. But I also wanted to tell you about many years ago, so many years ago, would date me. I was a colleague of Cokie's. She was part of a New Yorker cartoon. And the New Yorker cartoon, she was in the center and it showed everyone she knew. And it went everywhere. It was like, incredible graphic, right? She knew everyone. And I think that was one of Cokie's things. She had networked, she had known people from everywhere. And as you have said, Lisa, everyone felt that they knew Cokie and loved Cokie. Anyway, she was an incredible networker. And so I think that's part of her legacy, is that she was there for so many people. And even before TV, people knew Cokie. And to know her was to love her, right?
I'm just going to add a few comments because my sister Nina was so close with
Yes.
her. And first of all, she said that no matter what happened, no matter what terrible thing happened, because my sister's first husband
Yes.
died, she
Yes.
was there.
Yeah.
And when he died, and Cokie was at the airport waiting for the two of them when they were being shipped home. But my funniest and she was indefatigable. That she was, you know, she always knew she was going to be there. She was indefatigable for her work, for her friends, for
Right.
the nonprofit she sat on.
That's true. That's true.
So when Floyd was sick at one point, I used to come down on weekends and I would spend my days in the hospital sleeping because it was so boring. But then I'd go out to dinner with Nina and sort of keep her spirits up. One day, Cokie came in, and she came in at around 11 o'clock in the morning, and it was a Sunday, and she had taped ABC News earlier in the day, and it was showing the discussion with whatever the George Stephanopoulos show was called at that point. And we were waiting to go into the hospital room, and I sit there and I'm looking at Cokie. She's busy knitting because God forbid she has 5 seconds of freedom. And there are people sitting next to me and they're looking at her. She's sitting underneath the television and there she is knitting, and up above, they looking up above, and there she is talking, and they're going like this and like this and like this and like this. And when you were in the room, it was hilarious, but it absolutely showed that she was, you know, present all the time, just completely present. And she died, by the way, a year and a day before Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was, as you know, was one of Nina's great friends. So it's been a pretty hard couple of years for my sister in terms of loss, but she's been amazing at dealing with it.
Let's go to the next question. And Barbara, do you want to add anything before we go to the next question? She might be on mute. Okay, we'll go to Karen Hibna. You're up.
Hey there. So I'm just going to read my question so you know you've already thought about it a minute, Lisa. Just really fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. When NPR started in the 1970s, if the new wave of feminism was just gaining steam, and how do we keep the momentum of today's Me Too movement going, and what lessons did you learn from these NPR mothers that can help? I'm a huge Lynn Povich fan and really loved Dana Calvo's Good Girls Revolt series, and was so disappointed that they didn't renew that for the second season, because having lived through those times, I wanted to know how it came out.
Well, this is sort of not extension of it because it was sort of parallel, but, you know, it's so interesting to hear what all of the women said time and time again. As they got older and even more esteemed, younger women would ask them or, you know, look to them for help. And the women time and time again said, pick your battles. You know, Nina has said many times, you know, if some man makes a comment to you, just don't sweep it under the rug. But how, you know, people will say, how did you deal with a man, you know, complimenting you on your looks as opposed to your work? And basically their message was choose your battles. I think they've all said they're happy about the time that we're in today, where people can bring attention to bad things that happen to women. Linda talks about being chased around the desk by a congressman who was quite elderly when he was doing it. and the women of today, working women of today, young working women of today may find that horrifying, because of course it is, but the idea that they didn't let that kind of behavior stop them. They just basically tamped it down. Another thing Linda talks about is how a senator would address her as little lady, and she would call him big senator. And so I wish I had the answer to the bigger picture questions of how to deal with the movement, but I think just by having women in these roles, and that was what's so interesting, that these women were all the first women in their roles. Susan Stamberg, the first woman to anchor a nightly network newscast, and many of the public radio stations at the time were distressed that there was a woman in that job. And so, of course, now how you couldn't imagine that that would be a reaction among certainly public radio stations, that there'd be a woman on the air in an important role. But by virtue of what they've done in their work and what they continue to do in their work, particularly in the case of Nina, who's the most active of them, is extraordinary and helpful to the women and men and people around them. So many women said that by seeing Cokie on television talking about politics, which not that long before, with one notable exception being Cokie's mother, talking about politics, being involved with politics, it was so extraordinary for people to have these examples of women who were actually not just asked the questions about politics, but relied on to give voice.
I'm going to jump in for 1 second. I think we lost our screen
Sure.
for a second. I think Barbara, I think you're sharing your screen.
Oh, do you have the spy? It's a Spy magazine grid of the people who loved. Is it all the people who know? I think it's. Oh, I can't remember. I have it in the book. I can't remember the name of the graphic, but it was Spy magazine, center of the Cokie universe, center of the universe.
We just want to try to get we just want to try to get our screen back. Let's see, we have view options.
Let me see if I can find it. Actually.
There we go. I got it. There we go. Well, I will send that out because I actually have a copy of it. I've got a copy on file. I promise, on a stack of Bibles, stack of pancakes. It will get out because it is not only is it a funny thing to see, not only is it insightful, but the connections themselves are pretty earth-shattering. So I will get that out to everybody. Go ahead. I think let's see. Next is Sydney Stern, Anne Marie O'Connor, then me, then Tim.
Oh, Lisa, I can't wait to read your book. So I know this will be answered, and this is probably too wonky a question for this group. Instead of asking about the subjects, I'm interested in the challenge that you must have had in writing about 4 really interesting, really accomplished women. So you were trying to squeeze quarts and quarts and quarts into a pint container, right? So you want to talk about some of the challenges you had in writing it?
Well, the great part is that I did decide early on that it was going to be a limited scope, that I wasn't going to try to do what I described. It wasn't, my microphone or my phone now is on 2 recent biographies, one by David Michaelis about Eleanor Roosevelt, which is about 600 pages, and the other is 800 pages about Francis Bacon. So those are books each, which, because I've talked to the authors, have taken 10 years. This is a book that I knew I needed to do for the deadline or for the publication so that it came out when NPR anniversary was happening, to seize that momentum. But also I like to write the opposite kind of books, which are more slice of life targeted. So really that process is so interesting and immersive, but it's also weird because it's weird if it's one person, and it's weird if it's 5 or with an entity, because you're this intruder and yet you're using available resources. And in the case of all of the women, there were so many, in addition to talking to the three living women. There's so many available resources, so many speeches they gave, conversations they gave, but for me, it all went back to the 70s women's movement, the creation of public broadcasting, specifically public radio, and just how to twin those stories together, and sort of weed out for the women, in the case of the women, extraneous information. And so that it always went back to those two subjects. And then, of course, the big gift was when I realized the Frank Mankiewicz piece of it. That just seemed to me the perfect way to end the story when there was this denouement where he came on the scene and brought it acclaim and then almost killed it with financial decisions. But it was tough, and yet it was in some ways, like with the CNN book, easy. There's so much more to say about Ted Turner. My book about Ted Turner is about before he even married or knew Jane Fonda, but it just almost makes it easier when you have that kind of artifice of the story. And in this case, it worked out so perfectly because Susan and Linda started in 1971 before the first show aired. They were behind the scenes people, and their introduction to being on the air sort of happened as NPR built an audience. And then by the time Nina came in a couple of years later as a young reporter who they just needed to cover as many things as they possibly could, it was a new step in the development of the network, and there was a management change. And then by the time Cokie got hired by Frank Mankiewicz in 1978, NPR was reaching a different plateau. So that helped also, that the women, conveniently for me, showed up at certain times that made the story go along. And the fact that three of the women are virtually the same age. Susan's a little bit older. And that was also convenient too, because Susan had actually, like the rest of the women, just hit roadblocks earlier in her career, but also it had some interesting adventures with her husband, which is why she had moved to DC in the first place, and accidentally wound up working in educational radio before it was a thing. So each of the milestones that made them pertinent to the story of NPR also just made them, I think, were just interesting for the average person to see, to know about.
Thank you. It sounds like you structured a really good narrative. I can't wait to read it.
I hope so. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Anne-Marie O'Connor, you're up.
Yeah, I have friends who have fought their own diversity battles at NPR over the decades, and they've succeeded a lot, very well, and made it a lot smarter and a much better service. And I wonder what you think that NPR and other public radio, because Santa Monica Public Radio has gone through its ups and downs on some of these issues. What can public radio do to become more representative and better on this front?
It's so simple. Hire people who aren't just like themselves. I'm from a working class family. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was so unusual in the public radio, actually in any media organization that I've worked at. I'm 57. I started working in the early 80s, and virtually everywhere I've ever worked, I've been an unusual person for having come from the kind of family that I'm from. Another ism is ageism. There's people are routinely tossed out at these shops, even in public. Someone even actually asked me about the four women and how they had these enduring careers because they worked in radio. And I said, well, no, these women are superstars. No one's going to tell Nina that she's not working anymore because of her age. And Susan Stamberg, is still contributing to NPR and probably its chief proponent in terms of reaching out to the affiliates and fundraising for them. But most people, average people who don't reach the ranks of their superstardom, and of course, most of us never reached the acclaim that these four women did or have, it's really hard for us to find work. after a certain age. And it's really hard for people who aren't privileged to begin with. I was lucky that my mother broke her back so I could go to a private college. But you don't meet many people in public radio in particular who have not gone to private colleges and come from, whatever their race, come from well-educated families of a certain means. And so that's the problem. And they try to do the outreach. I wrote a book about Joan Kroc a bunch of years ago, and Joan Kroc, also from working class stock, married an incredibly wealthy man named Ray Kroc with McDonald's, and took all of his money, and as you probably know, a huge slice of it, but not the hugest slice of it, went to NPR. And they have fellowships that are designed to bring in people who aren't from wealth and privilege, but it's somehow, it's harder to stay in that business if the money is better than it was, certainly when the four women I write about started working in the profession of radio, which was a new thing then. But it's a challenge in so many ways, and they're constantly discussing it. I know someone told me this week there was a big conversation about it again, but it takes just actually doing it instead of talking about it. And I hope they keep figuring out a way to do the outreach and bring people in.
Okay, I'll go
I don't know if
next.
that's.
Okay, go ahead. I'll go next.
No, I just.
Yeah, and I'll expand this one up a little bit. You want to get Jill Totenberg's thoughts. You touched on some of the sisterhood between all four. Give us some examples. I mean, Jill gave us a great example when Senator Haskins was ill, that Cokie was there to be helpful. But walk us through what it must have been like for four women who were in a male-dominated environment, how their friendship helped strengthen them as we went from the 70s to the 80s and beyond.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly an entire book could be written by all of them about that and all their loved ones who know. But Linda talks a lot about how, she was like me she was the daughter of a butcher, grocery store owner in Carlsbad, New Mexico, who got a scholarship that enabled her to go to Wellesley. And, fast forward a little bit, I detail it in the book, but fast forward a little bit, here she is making her way at National Public Radio from behind the scenes onto the air. And then Cokie Roberts walks in, and she could have just, tripped the woman, because clearly Cokie Roberts was natively, as Linda put it, born in the boiler room of Congress. And here's Linda, who studied so hard to understand the workings of Congress. She's covering it. She's finally got the voice that she wanted, that she hadn't been able to get elsewhere in her career as a reporter. As she was told, she couldn't be on the air. And finally, she's got this chance, and Cokie walks in, and she should have been freaked out. And instead of being freaked out, and this is obviously testament to Cokie, but also testament to Linda, they tag teamed it. They worked together. They united forces. And Linda didn't have children, so that when there were issues for Cokie with her kids that she had to juggle, Linda didn't mind stepping in. And in so many workplaces, of course, that wouldn't have been the case. They would have been adversaries and not allies. But they managed to form this partnership. And I think it was Barbara who might have mentioned that they were chosen to be on The Lawmakers, which was a show that was short-lived about Congress on public. Well, I don't know how short-lived it was, but it wasn't a long-standing show on PBS, where there was an older white man host, and they were brought in together. So it's time and again they talk about how they backstopped one another, and they had a friendly rivalry, but they recognized that they were stronger together. And what's interesting too is that as NPR was developing in the 70s and becoming bigger and adding programs, and certainly once Frank Mankiewicz came in, they recognized that they had power at that point. Gravitas, both because they were there at that point, they were in their 30s and a little bit older than many of the younger people coming into NPR, and so they would advocate for not just for each other Susan was a dynamite person about herself. Why am I working holidays? Why am I, when she was hired as a production assistant behind the scenes, she would only work part-time because she had a very young child and she didn't want to miss meals with him every night. And then even once she got elevated to the host chair, she insisted that she leave at 5 o'clock, 5:30, so that she could be home for dinner in the middle of the show. So they knew how to stand up for themselves, and they stood up for one another. And in so doing, they made it easier at that time. Obviously now NPR is a completely different place, and they rose to certain levels where, of course, their situations would be different, but they were key in setting this groundwork that made it a friendlier place for women. And as Frank Mankiewicz said, you get more bang for your buck if you hire women, which of course, imagine him saying that today. But women were able to show up at NPR in the earliest days because many of them did have husbands and didn't need to make the money. And of course, the world is a completely different place now, and it's largely because these women set the scene.
I'll open that one up to Jill and to Catherine to get your thoughts on that question. Jill Totenberg and Catherine Roberts, and perhaps Barbara, if she wants to discuss it.
I
Go
would
ahead,
say
Catherine.
that Nina wasn't dependent upon a man ever.
Right, exactly.
We were lucky. Our father, we're one of 3 girls. Our father really thought that women were brilliant and could make things happen when men couldn't. And so with that kind of support behind us, there was no way that she was going to not be independent. And she married Floyd when she was 32, and she was well on her way by that point. So I don't know about the
Sorry,
others.
I didn't mean to lump Nina in that. Yes, Nina made her way to DC on her own, and yes, began her career on her own. I just meant that the other 3 women were married and have said, I've heard them say, right, that it was possible for them to work. When Susan Stamberg left WAMU, where she had been working and probably not making a whole lot, she took a pay cut to go and work part-time at this new startup called NPR. And she said, I was able to do that because I had my husband's salary too. And Linda Wertheimer and Cokie were in similar situations. That doesn't mean that they were happy about it or strapped. It's just more to say that at the time, the expectation, the generalized expectation was that women were maybe able to make less money because they weren't, quote unquote, supporting themselves. But that's, again, not a diss on them. It's just the sad reality of how things were. And NPR, by the way, at that time, underpaid everybody. It wasn't just women are making less money. I mean, they just didn't pay well at all. And thankfully, the union came in, and Linda was a shop steward. And once the union came in, that helped a little bit. It still didn't, make it equivalent to network salaries or elsewhere, but just to clarify that.
Okay, Catherine, you're up. You're on mute.
I think she's talking to somebody else.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Catherine, you want to talking to us?
I thought Catherine Roberts was
Hi.
talking for a second.
Yes, it's Catherine Roberts. I was a colleague of both Linda, Nina, Cokie, since I was actually at NPR a little bit before Cokie, and we are sisters-in-law, but I can speak to everything Lisa has said being accurate about the salaries and the union and all of that. But there is a larger question, which someone recently asked me, why did they stay? And I think that for a group of us at that era, no, we were not paid industry scale. We weren't. You paid more money, you were paid more at the Post, paid more at CBS. Definitely, we were not paid as much. There were great benefits at NPR. But I think for a number of women, which included the focus of this conversation. The benefits were terrific. And there was a sense that as women, we could be in a position to affect change. And no, it wasn't easy in the beginning. I was there, believe me, I started in 1977. But it was a thing, and I think that was huge. And I think there were a number of men who actually left NPR to go make more money elsewhere, blah, blah, blah. But for this group of women, it was a place to put yourself and be able to be agents of change. And that's what happened.
Catherine,
Okay,
you should tell the story of how you met your husband.
there you
Oh,
go.
God. Well, so you guys aren't here for this, but I will just tell you the Cokie
Well,
Roberts.
this is why we are here for this. And let me
No.
tell you, it's the stories that come out of left field, like this one, which really are, which are the frosting on the cake. So go for it.
So Cokie was my colleague and my friend. We were, at that time I was a reporter. I've been a reporter and a producer at NPR. Anyway, I'd had a long and disastrous relationship with someone else. And Cokie came up to me one day and said, when you're ready, I'm going to invite you, I'm going to introduce you to a nice man. Months go by. I'm not really interested. I go to a party at their house of 40 people. There were 2 people who were not married, me and the man that I later married, who happened to be Cokie's brother-in-law. Now I knew that Cokie had I knew that my brother-in-law Steve had a twin. He was married, so I was so confused. Anyway, it was a total setup, and Linda and Nina were totally part of this situation. It was a total setup. And anyway, short story, we were married a year and a month later in the same garden where we met, in their backyard. So, Linda, Nina, Cokie, this was my marriage. They helped me get married, and I'm ever grateful for that. Ever.
And before we go to the next question, maybe I'll open this up to Hale as well. I've heard more stories about the Boggs Christmas parties at Washington D.C. in the Washington D.C. home. Lanny Davis was telling me this story that must have gone on for 30 minutes about how he was this young student. All of a sudden, next thing he knows, he's talking to members of Congress. It was a total fanboy experience for him. And I wish he was here today. But walk me through that, how that was like, because it seemed to be this intersection of media, politics, and a variety of other places. And I'll open that one up.
Hale, go for
it. He stepped away for a second.
Okay. Apparently, Lindy and Hale Sr. gave a great garden party every year. And it was the most inclusive party ever. It's before my time. But it was apparently a great party to be part of. And Lindy did all the cooking. I mean, none of us can kind of fathom the day where we would all cook for 100 people. But Lindy did that. So it was a famous garden party. Yeah.
Wow. Let's move on to Michael Werner. You're up, Michael.
Yeah, on a somewhat lighter note, people who don't live in Washington, D.C. might be amused to note that there's a bakery on Connecticut Avenue which sells something called the Cokie Roberts, which I think is probably the ultimate accolade.
Yes.
And which is a very good cookie, incidentally. It's the bread first restaurant. The question I have for our author is, you wrote about these 4 women, and are there any commonalities of their experience which you can sort of boil down to maybe a few sentences that I might someday share with my granddaughters as they grow a little bit older and ready to start facing the world? How did these women overcome the adversity that inevitably came their way?
That's an excellent question. They all came from very different backgrounds, but they all had absolutely loving parents. loving, as Jill was describing about her parents, loving and devoted and just incredible parents. That came across in all of them. No question that there was an impediment in their world because they were women, or just an impediment in their world in the case of Linda and Susan, who are from more modest families, that you can't do this or you shouldn't do this, not one bit. So that was really resonant for me and exciting for me, and for the reason that you say, because if you were to give a prescription to a young girl or young woman now about how to make it, that I don't have children. I come from a difficult background, but I would say that would be what I would tell you to tell or to show those girls in your life. For sure.
That's a really interesting answer. That would have been the last thing that I would have thought you would come up with. So it's quite striking that in fact it was the first thing.
Yeah, interesting that you said. What would you thought I might have said? I'm curious.
I have thought it might have something to do with grit or being opportunistic or self-confidence. All these things, of course, could be a result of their upbringing. So maybe they're not totally decoupled, but it's a very interesting way to look at it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
My
pleasure.
I just want to add something to this. I don't know many people on this video conference know that Nina was a college dropout.
Oh.
And she has something like 30 honorary degrees at this point. But when she decided to drop out of school, she got bored, and she said to her mother that she wanted to drop out. And my mother said that she was ready to start being a reporter. So my mother said, okay, if it doesn't work, you can go back to school. And we all know that what happened then. She never went back to school. But you're right, Michael. She was absolutely dogged in doing things, and she got stuck on the women's desk at the Herald Leader in Boston, and then at night would spend her nights running around the city with the cops doing a crime scene reporting. So she really worked her ass off. And during the 1968 election, she would go up to New Hampshire to cover the primary in New Hampshire after working a full week. She just worked nonstop.
Wow. Tim Farley, you have the next question.
Great. Thank you so much. This is just a delightful conference. But I just want to make a comment. I know Catherine Roberts is on the call, and so is Hale Boggs. And I just want to tell you personally, I'm 61 years old. I met a ton of people in my life, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, a couple of prime ministers and so forth. But I can say, honestly, candidly, the single most gracious person I've ever met in my entire life was Mrs. Boggs. And that is something that I just can't say enough. I walked away thinking I was the most special person in the world. I know I'm stepping on everybody else here, but since I have the two of you here, I just wanted to share that experience. And 30 years later, it's still a high point of my life. And I just wanted to share that with the two of you there.
Thank you. I agree.
Thank you so much. Yes, I agree too.
There was actually a wonderful, I think it was PBS did an hour biography of Lindy Boggs I think it was toward the end of her time in Congress. And it was really actually quite, it's probably, you can probably find it somewhere on YouTube. But I'll take the next question. To Lisa, in this interesting media environment today, could a national public radio have been successfully launched, or was there something unique about the late 60s, early 1970s, the desire that Congress would support, or readers or listeners would support something new and different? Did we just happen to catch lightning in a bottle at that point, or is there something I missed?
No, I think it is. I think that the answer, obviously, is always impossible to know, but the answer is the latter, which is that it was a unique moment in time. And what's interesting is that what the audience was going to be wasn't even part of the discussion. I looked at lots and lots and lots of papers from the very earliest days, and that was not, finding a market wasn't the issue. In fact, it was almost the opposite. It was reaching new people, giving voices a different platform than they had before, and no one would have ever called it a platform. But yeah, I think just as with Ted Turner and CNN and that unique moment in time, this is the same. This is the same.
Who's
That
next?
doesn't mean that something can't
I'm
come
sorry.
up now, but of course, journalism is different. Everything is different. Everything is different now.
And I guess the follow-up question to that, it's kind of a half follow-up question, is obviously Nina was married to a former US Senator from Colorado. Cokie came from a very political family. Did any of them at any time, being reporters looking outside, viewing in, catch the political bug themselves and consider, well, maybe there's a congressional seat that could have my name on it or something along those lines? Because we've seen where people in media have made the move into elective office.
Not at all. Not even, I mean, the family members can say it even more emphatically than I can, but I from reading, watching, talking a lot, I've seen absolutely zero indication. And Cokie said many times that she wasn't going to go into quote unquote the family business because her husband was a journalist. But I think that once she became a journalist herself, it wasn't even a concept, an option, a thought for any of them. No. In fact, someone asked me last week, how come the other three women didn't go more, besides, Nina obviously did a lot of TV at one point and still does. Linda did some TV, Susan did some TV, but they were so committed to the network and their careers as journalists. So.
Hale, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this. I have some thoughts on this question.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, it's only come to into my radar recently, but apparently in the later years of Cokie's life, she was feeling as if could she have done more had she been in politics? Now, I think Cokie was the most naturally born journalist who's ever existed. It just came to her naturally. But I do think that the notion of public service was something that she grappled with. And, one can argue, or we used to back in the day, that being a journalist was part of public service. But I think that in her later years, she was grappling with, could she have done more? But she was the most naturally born journalist I've ever met in my life.
I'll ask another question because if you want to ask a question, throw your name into the chat function. Just a quick reminder. I'll ask one more question that comes up in the book. Walk us through the causes of NPR's financial challenges at that point, and it's where the book, it's kind of the Makowitz section of the book. Walk us through how that impacted them, how it impacted the network, and how it impacted NPR going forward after the case. Because I don't think people realize that how close NPR came to dying.
Right. That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Well, Frank came in and he was a superstar in his own right, from his own world. And he, like the rest of the women, Susan and Linda, of course, didn't know about NPR because it was just launching, but it was not a known commodity to him. And it wasn't an aspiration to him to run this network, but he was courted and given the job and loved media. And even though he'd come from a political background and felt he had a degree in journalism and had actually worked in journalism, but his main career had been both as a lawyer, public servant and also, in politics with Robert Kennedy, of course. And so he had been writing some books and was brought from that world into NPR and fell in love with the people and the possibilities of this network, and just grew too fast and spent too much money. And that financial problem led to the possible just sort of dissolution of the place. And the women stepped up to help save it, both in part because they were sort of ringleaders they could have each one of them could have run the joint if they wanted to, because they had the mentality of producers. But they just had this fierce adoration of the place, and also fear about what was happening as it was imploding financially around them, which was revealed slowly over a period of time. That it snowballed. It got worse and worse, the financial, and then he got yanked out, and a man came in to save it and sort of right the ship. And it was in the aftermath of that the structure of public radio as we know it today was created. Before then, the whole financial structure was different in the way that member stations paid for the programming. They didn't really pay for the programming. It was more, it's too probably complex to get into here, but it just completely shifted the financial ecosystem of NPR to what we know it as today. And so that was an interest. I hope I do a better job laying it out in the book than I am articulating it right here. But basically, Frank was, as I say, he dazzled people, he dazzled Congress, he dazzled Washington because he was who he was, and he was an amazing raconteur and charming and bold. He had great ideas. But at the same time, the ideas basically, one idea, just to throw it out there, is that he did an episodic audio show about Star Wars, which at the time, of course, has gone on to be the biggest blockbuster franchise ever, but it was then a big franchise. And he managed to wrangle the audio rights for NPR of an episodic show that brought, huge audience and acclaim, and but the money was incidental, as is often the case with great brains. That's sort of to the side. So I think the whole story about him it's actually important, obviously, because it did shift the way NPR raised money and interacted with its member stations, which then, of course, were a fraction the number than they are today.
Who's up? Who has a question? Jump in.
Michael Werner again. I should know, but I don't. Can you tell us in a few sentences about how NPR got started? Was it a federal mandate, or was it started by interested private citizens?
No. It was the Johnson's Public Television Act of '67 was about creating a more representative, people were worried in the 60s about the growing mind share of commercial broadcasting or control over mind share of commercial broadcasting. And so the Public Broadcasting Television Act was created to fund, not politicize, but to fund stations that have been licensed, television stations that have been licensed around the country, to create a network that would create better programming. And it was a group of men from educational radio stations licensed to universities around the country, who stepped up and literally had it pasted into the act, the words radio, and that made the Public Broadcasting Act, Public Television Act, the Public Broadcasting Act. And basically, NPR was chartered in 1970, run by a group of men from these stations, with a $5 million budget and no clear mandates. It was basically left to the people, I can't remember how many board members there were at the time, to come up with what public radio would be. And the whole idea was that they were going to create a service that would feed out to these educational stations around the country, most of which had budgets of less than $25,000 a year. They were not the powerhouses that you know of today, the KCRWs and AMUs. They were little sleepy stations that were basically playthings of universities in the best possible sense. Professors would give lectures, there would be book readings, music shows by students. They were not 24/7. They were not raising money. They were basically just little ancillary pieces to, in most cases, to the universities that held their licenses. And so this was to upgrade and professionalize what was pumped out to them and create a service. But like I say, no one knew out of the gate that it was going to become what it became. The first news show that they offered was All Things Considered. And, you know, the joke about that is that they drive time is when radio was most utilitarian. And at that time, radio was kind of faltering, but they basically decided not to do a morning drive time show right out of the gate, because that would have meant that people would have had to show up at work in the middle of the night. Nobody wanted to do that. So they chose 5 p.m. and it was something like 30 people on the staff, maybe 30 or 40 people. And many of them weren't assigned to this program. They were just support staff in other ways. So it was really grassroots is the only way to describe it. They just had no idea. And Bill Siemering, who's sort of acknowledged as the founding father of public radio, had come from the University of Buffalo by way of Wisconsin. And he was really deeply committed to the idea that the broadcasting not sound like the broadcasting that you heard at the time among the white men who were the hosts of most of radio and television. So he was very committed to both diversity in the types of voices that you heard, but also that it sound conversational. So you can really thank him for what he introduced. But, you know, of course, the women lived that or embodied that in their own ways.
And before we go on to Sandra and then Sydney, you know, you talk about the National Public Radio voice. You know, I kind of kidded about it earlier, and how there is, it's kind of this vocal type where you have long form journalism meets, you know, radio meets kind of an empathetic conversational tone to all of this. I mean, was that by accident, or was that did that just evolve in that direction, or was there a mandate? Or I mean, maybe Jill and maybe Catherine can take a crack at this and say, how did that become what it is? I mean, it's something unique, and a number of local NPR radio stations will emulate that type of vocal flow, for lack of a better word, the intonation. But walk us through that a bit, if you could.
Well, Catherine, having been there in the 70s, can certainly talk about it, but I'll just say briefly that it really was that Bill Siemering mandate out of the gate that they not replicate what you could hear on CBS radio or, you know, the other network radio offerings or television offerings. He actually tried to hire a Black co-anchor for All Things Considered. And the man would not agree to come because he didn't want to give up a good job at the network. So Bill launched the show with a man named Robert Conley, who was not a well-known commodity at the time. But basically, the idea was that it was more storytelling, and there are people from Catherine's era at NPR who were angry about the way that NPR became more news-oriented rather than more feature-oriented. Susan used to do these incredible, many minutes long interviews with artists and with all kinds of people, which, you know, don't exist today because the whole media ecosystem is so different. And yet that you know, and that's a whole other conversation that's so in the weeds about where NPR started and where it went. But basically, from the very beginning, the whole idea was that it wasn't supposed to sound like anything else you heard in commercial broadcasting. And that gave rise to this concept of more accessible or more spoken word storytelling, we call it in the business sound rich storytelling, where you hear these, you're brought to another place. But yeah, there was a dissent among the ranks in the 70s about whether it should become more hard news or more, stay more in that featurey route. But yeah, that was not by accident that happened.
So I would like to thank Lisa for the shout out to Bill Seymour, because he may be the most brilliant person who invented NPR as we know today. He certainly was. And I was lucky to have known him and to have somehow followed in his path. But she's right, it was a progression. I don't remember, because I was there in the 70s and the 80s as we developed. So I started when there was only All Things Considered weekday. Then we did weekend ATC. Then we did morning edition. I don't remember there being rancor about it, but she's right. It became increasingly clear that we were a place where people got their news, and therefore we had to be a place that gave them news throughout the day. So we began doing, broadcasts of 5-minute newscasts on the hour, that kind of thing. And that was a transition. But I will say that Bill Seymour was a brilliant guy. And when NPR started All Things Considered, it was a different format. Today, if you use the word news magazine, and you might be thinking of 60 Minutes or something, you say, oh yeah, okay, that's fine. But at the time, it was absolutely groundbreaking. And Bill Seymour brought that to public radio, and NPR made that happen. And it was a fun thing to be part of. I will tell you that.
Bob, your audio is off, Bob.
Sandra, you're up. Did we lose her?
No, I'm here. I'm here. Yeah, just before I ask a question, let me just anecdotally say that my children, as they grew up on NPR. And my daughter, as she went off to college, said she wasn't so much homesick, she was just missing NPR. And now I have grandchildren who have been brought up on NPR, and the 9-year-old was telling me, discussing with me the election and all the news this last fall and post-fall in ways that blew me away. And it was all coming off of All Things Considered and Morning Edition. So I bet there are a lot of NPR children floating around.
I think that's right.
Yeah, but my question, it's just the anecdote, but my question, just going back, Lisa, you were nicely telling us that Mankiewicz spent a lot of money. When did he get replaced? What year was that? And then
1983.
1983, okay. And then after that, NPR developed this fundraising days, weeks model that PBS has picked up on, and I think I have it in the right order. When did that seems to get more and more sophisticated as we move along here.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that NPR doesn't raise money. It's the member stations that raise money. That's an important distinction. That happened several years. That amped up. I mean, it already existed before, but it amped up in the aftermath of this 1983 financial crisis. As for PBS, I couldn't speak to that. There's actually a super book that came out last year at the same week my CNN book did, called Sunny Days, which is about the birth of public television. And it may be in there by an author named David Camp. But yeah, I don't know more about the sophistication, and certainly the sophistication of fundraising everywhere. It's such a different world for nonprofits than it ever was before. And the funny thing about Joan Kroc, having written about her, is that she tried to give an equal amount of money. Well, she allocated what wound up being about $250 million, and she wanted to give half to public television and half to NPR, which at that point had been equipped to accept gifts, but not the way that you give gifts to your local member station. And PBS didn't answer her people's calls, so that money entirely went to NPR in 2004 after she died. So, but I'm sorry, I don't know more about PBS and its fundraising and how that works, and nor do I understand or I've studied the structure of PBS. I know a lot of people mistakenly conflate the two things. Yeah. They certainly conflate NPR with the member stations. Both, it's probably good for both that they see them as a whole. It's a whole branding exercise, but it's just a tangent.
And Sydney, you're up. You're on mute. There you go.
You're right. Sorry, I think you answered the question, Lisa. If you turn this book out this fast, that Frank was long dead, but it kind of amuses me because his tenure was such an important part of his bio, and it never said drove it into the ground. It just said ran it. So.
Right. Well, I do say that in this book. So if anybody reads the book in the family, they might be mad. But I mean, no, I didn't mean that way. But I just meant because you never know when you write a book if people will read it. But no, he always said that his epitaph would have that he was a person who announced Robert F. Kennedy's death to the public. But no, the NPR thing. Yeah, not his best moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure about his Peace Corps days either. So, but he
right.
wasn't. Thank you.
I want to say something before you close up because we're getting towards the end.
We're getting right to the end.
You can imagine that a lot of people ask me, what did Nina think about the book? So I decided I would be very politic and say I haven't asked her or anything like that. But I did ask her, and since there are a lot of people here who are either waiting to get their book or have gotten their book already and haven't had a chance to read it like me, I wanted to tell you that Nina said it's a really good read. It's a lot of fun, and that Lisa did an unbelievable job with the worst kind of situation where she was stuck in her house during COVID and turned out this really amazing history. So I wanted you all to have the endorsement from one of the things. You're welcome.
That was a huge praise from her and the other two women, because this was unauthorized and it's an awkward situation, but they were amazing. And so I talked to Nina when I ran through airports, and she was driving all over the place and asked to fact check things, and she was always, I couldn't believe how she's unbelievable. I wish she would write her memoir. Maybe you can convince her to do it, but I doubt it. But thank you so much for saying that.
And that's probably the best place to wrap things up. I want to thank everybody for coming today. Not only Lisa, but the wonderful commentary, color commentary from Jill, from Catherine, from Barbara, and from Hale. And this has really been a lot of fun. So I'll be in touch with everybody on the book piece. Here's what's coming up, and we're gonna have some fun. An old friend of ours, Alan Zweibel, who is a lot of fun. If you know who Alan is, just one of the, well, besides being one of the first comedy writers of SNL, does a lot of work with Billy Crystal. He's got a new movie coming out very soon. We'll be doing a lunch with him. It's just a lot of fun, and we're gonna have some of the original cast of SNL joining us, and that'll be fun. In fact, we had a luncheon with Lorraine Newman and Melanie Shardoff, two friends of ours, in which Alan and Rosie Schuster, again, two of the original SNL writers, they'll be around the table. Sadly, our old friend Ann Beats passed away, which is just absolutely heartbreaking. So we got that coming up. We got a bunch of other stuff. And I think one of the things that Anne-Marie and I were talking about was, working with her and Randy Schoenberg on stolen Nazi artwork, stuff like that. All sorts of stuff coming up. It'll be a blast. And it has been a blast. For those who aren't familiar with us, I think in the email signature I have, it goes back over the last 26 years of Luncheon Society folks, Luncheon Society gatherings. We're going to have, once we have a little more time with the current Mars mission wandering around the surface, we'll go back to John Callis, who Michael knows very well. John is our good friend who ran the Spirit and Opportunity program, and we'll get a good update on what's going on Mars. All sorts of fun stuff coming up. Just pay attention, watch your email. And again, thank you so much for coming. Lisa, thank you so much for today. Take care and have a great weekend.